We have education funding on page 7. A major feature of the legislation is the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund, which provides special funding to school districts in the state. This is helping to stave off firings and cutbacks of teachers and educational operation levels throughout the country, especially in areas where teachers either were not being hired or were on the verge of possibly not keeping their jobs. So we see some of the outline of this on page 7. We see on page 8 the increased funding for existing federal education programs. And you can see from Head Start to Pell Grants to education of homeless children, some of the increases in here. One of the other major parts of the recovery package is in FMAP, Federal Medical Assistance Percentage, which is basically the Medicaid program on page 11. And you can see the various kinds of funding breakouts to the state, to the local government. You'll see on page 12 that this is going to be spread out over a 3-year period. New York State has already received its first installment, which is probably the first funded program that the state received after the president signed the legislation. And you can see the calculation of how New York State's FMAP is based on page 13. On page 14, we have a chart that outlines some of the children and family programs. You can see by some of the numbers we listed here, the national number you'll see for the child care block grant of about $2 billion. New York State received $100 million. That's a pretty considerable chunk of money. New York State received the second highest amount of funding in this program of all 50 states. On page 15, and keep in mind also that this funding in the entire program goes to state governments or localities, depending on the program. There's some competitive money which I'll cover for things like mass transit and high-speed rail, but also a great amount of the money goes to individuals directly. Food stamp recipients highlighted here on page 15 is a good example of that. The average family of 4 now receiving food stamps will basically see an increase of about $80 a month beginning next month. So we're talking in terms of real people, real dollars right away. We have more money coming in on page 17, workforce investment, unemployment insurance, trade act assistance. In transportation, on pages 20, I believe 21, we can see the kind of money coming in for mass transit, highways, bridges, rail, other kinds of discretionary programs. One of the priorities we've got in the state Senate is high-speed rail, especially in the corridors from New York to Albany and from Albany to Buffalo. And we're hoping, as last week Senator Smith was in Washington and met with President Obama, and we're urging that there even be high-speed rail from New York all the way to Chicago. We have some mutual interest from Illinois to New York. We have other breakouts in this area. We have money for Rochester, page 24, in the region of $15.8 million. And then we have some high-speed rail that's mentioned on page 25. That's basically a competitive program. The federal government has listed eligible high-speed rail corridors throughout the country, and it's the responsibility of the Secretary of Transportation to recommend which programs to begin funding. This will be based on competitive bidding. You can see on page 27, in the housing area, we have low-income tax credits, neighborhood stabilization, community block grants, weatherization, public housing, homeless prevention, and again, New York gets some pretty considerable money coming out of the national pot compared to other states. And we have a little bit of an outline on page 28 on the stimulus areas in the housing category. When you look at tax cuts, again, these are for people directly on page 31. Most of them are outlined in here. One that has been highlighted is that if you're a first-time home buyer and you qualify for the deduction, this is a one-time, first-ever effort, just to give you an example. And then each of the different credits are outlined on the pages through 34. On page 35 is really a very unique tax deduction for car purchasers. That for this calendar year, purchasers of new cars get a tax break and a deduction from your state and local taxes. I plan to buy a car myself based partially on this, and a broken differential in the car. We have other tax cuts. The first-time home buyer credit is outlined on page 38. Small business, literally, second page. When we have small business tax cuts are outlined on page 40. Capital expenses, write-offs on capital expenditures. For environmental issues, beginning on page 42, I think as Congresswoman Slaughter mentioned, we have the Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund and the Drinking Water Fund, which, as she mentioned, is a major impact for small towns. And you can see some of the environmental funding breakdowns in the following pages 44, outlines on page 45, and some of the other innovative energy programs on page 46. A new initiative on broadband. We're going to have somebody speak on that on page 47. For the public health issues on pages 49 and 50, health insurance. One of the unique direct-to-people programs here is a COBRA initiative that would extend COBRA assistance health insurance to workers who lose their jobs. For crime prevention, law enforcement issues, 2 programs that go directly to law enforcement localities, police departments are the Edward Byrne Justice Assistance Grants and the Community-Oriented Policing Services, the COPS program, which is now about 10, 12 years old and is getting a new shot of money. We have an outline on page 53 of some of the minority participation issues in the stimulus program that are targeted to certain communities. As Congresswoman Slaughter had mentioned, the White House has a breakdown of the estimated job creation numbers by congressional districts. We have that chart for you on page 54, where there's an average of about 7,500 estimated jobs to be created in total by all these different programs.